Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Saudis and his team for inviting us to speak, and thanks, Lauren, for that great introduction and overview. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about more specific case studies and examples and typologies. And again, it's just a flavour, it's just the top line. We haven't had a chance in the 25-30 minutes sort of slot that we've been allotted. We haven't had a chance to go down into the granular detail. So firstly, let's set the scene in Uganda. The first country we're talking about is Uganda. And we've got a map here again from another EIA study that they collected all the open source information as well as traffic reports. Traffic is a CITES related organization that works with governments to record all incidences of trade in ivory. So this is all ivory flows to, not to Uganda, but from Uganda or via Uganda. Uganda, very much from 2014 onwards, started to become prominent in large-scale ivory sieges on the continent, and it seemed like it was becoming, and it later it became apparent that it had become a real consolidation hub for some major cross-border transnational organized criminal syndicates that had adopted Uganda and had chosen to exploit it, basically. There are high risks of corruption prevalent there. There's loose governments. At the time, there was less legislation in place around wildlife and less harsh penalties than they have now. So things have moved on a lot, but during that period from 2000 to 2020, which is what this map represents, there was an awful lot of movement of product. And this is product flows, but where the product flows, the money will also flow. So we'll look at the money in more detail, but you can see that the nexus is very much moving product from west to east, and then the money will flow predominantly from east to west. There's obviously smaller amounts that move around the continent as people move shipments and consolidate ivory and pangolin consignments together from source countries like DRC, Tanzania, that suffered an awful lot of poaching in sort of 2011 to 2014, and the southern African states as well, where there are large elephant populations. And these consolidate, these flows, they're like a watershed, and they will move towards the path of least resistance. And for a while, Uganda has played that role. And I'll talk a little bit to the progress they're making as well. So drilling down then, looking at the values of illegal wildlife commodities that are popular. And forgive me, Lauren, because these are the charismatic species that we focused on for this particular research study. But that, the point is to remind you that it is more than just the elephants and the rhinos and the pangolins. But these are the sort of values that kilos of these products are fetching for international demand actor buyers. So they're being achieved on the African continent, but they are at the apex of that pyramid. So as the pyramid then goes out into the cross-continental flows. So we're looking at ivory fetching between $70 and $125 a kilo. That's gone down an awful lot in the last decade. It was at its peak, it was at more like $300, $350 a kilo in around sort of 2012, 2014. But it started to drop, and that's been a lot to do with the changes made at an international level, where China has been significant in outlawing the legal markets in ivory, which was for certified ivory before a certain year. The legislation around ivory has been hugely complex in that it offers the chance for criminal syndicates to exploit these licit markets by commingling illicit products and using false certification and so on. So by shutting down the legal markets, which they did in late 2017, early 2018, it's made a huge difference to the demand, which has led to the price drop. And the economists around you will understand what that means in terms of how that might affect the product flows. Rhino horn is still very, very, very valuable at 8,000 to 17,000 a kilo. And there's some very active flows of that, but they're much smaller quantities in the consignment. So you might see news reports in your country that says somebody was arrested with 10 kilos of rhino horn and think that's not very much. Trust me, it's worth an awful lot of money, and it's well worth pursuing the sort of money laundering risks and crimes associated with that. Pangolin scales, again, they don't appear to, against the rhino horn comparison, they don't appear to be worth that much, but they are traded in vast quantities. And unfortunately, because the pangolin's a very secretive animal, nobody really knows how many we've got left, because there have been hundreds of tons of pangolins exported from the African continent. We know about probably around 100 tons in the last 5 years. And we know that as a rule of thumb, we detect about 10% of what actually is moving in the illicit flows and supply chains. So you can imagine that the pangolin populations are taking a beating, quite literally. So how does the money move? If that's the product, how does that money move then? If you remember the pyramid that Lauren presented, where you've got the more senior high-level offenders at the top of that pyramid, and you've got the cannon fodder, the lower level, the poachers and the community members, the illegal fishers and so on at the bottom, and then you've got all the middlemen in between. Well, the value chain and the money flows is similar. So at the left-hand side of this chart, we have the formal banking system and foreign exchange bureaus, and these are used for the larger amounts, the round sums. There is a certain amount of concealment that sometimes happens where people like to put a strange, $22,864 sort of figure in order to conceal the fact that they're looking for a round sum. But essentially, we still see 40,000, 80,000, 100,000, 20,000, nice round numbers going backwards and forwards. In the foreign exchange bureaus, the values are less, often because of the daily limits and the compliance on that. But there are still, that's still used an awful lot, including money value transfer services like Western Union and Sendwave and so on, to move money around between those middlemen and brokers and the people that are consolidating the shipments and facilitating the supply chain. Then we start, as we move right on this chart, we start to get into the smaller amounts where money is moving around, and on the far right we've got cash payments, cash is still king at many levels in some of the jurisdictions you guys are operating in. We've got, certainly in rural areas where you're paying poachers and transporters, it will be done with cash and possibly mobile money. We also see the presence of cash and other smaller receipts in the trade-based money laundering that is used to conceal the proceeds of crime or the payments that are made to facilitate the supply chain. So we see the use of front companies. That's something that FATF have made clear in their report in 2020 on the connections, the money laundering risks of IWT, of illegal wildlife trade. But the use of front companies to conceal the movement of funds or products as well. Import-export companies are a common red flag typology for wildlife trade, because you've got to move the product and it's a handy vehicle to also conceal some of those illicit financial flows. I should also mention, we were talking about Uganda specifically, and there hasn't been that much evidence of hawala and barter systems being used in Uganda, although I'm sure it does go on. But hawala and flying money, Feijian, I think it's pronounced, is a very common way for organized crime syndicates with Asian or Arabian, sort of Middle Eastern connections within the nexus. It's a very common way for them to move money, which avoids using traditional banking systems. So the normative systems that we're used to, the sending a transaction, a telegraphic transfer or an EFT or whatever, that doesn't come into it. What you've got a hawalada in one country who takes a cash payment or some other sort of form of payment from the buyer, let's say, which in this case you probably can't see this map, but for those of you that want a copy of the presentation, you'll be able to zoom in on it and look at it in more detail. But this comes from a case study conducted by Traffic into a network that involved Gabon, which supplied the elephant ivory, Nigeria, which was the consolidation area and where the consignments were assembled and then left that was the exit point for the African continent. And then those consignments were shipped via Kuwait and the UAE to Lao PDR as the end destination, the consumer country. So you can see that there are a lot of different countries involved in both the product flows and in the money flows, which is the the payment lines within this diagram, the money flows did not mirror the product flows and didn't use the traditional banking system. The big payments, the small payments to poachers and so on at the first level of that pyramid, of that supply chain pyramid, were made in cash. And then the payments were then made in large sums that were made to Hawala dealers, where the guy in Gabon would send money, would receive money from the guys in Lao PDR via the Hawala system. So this is a check and balance system, which periodically the Hawala dealers will reconcile their books with each other, but they will only do that periodically. So it's exceedingly difficult to actually track those financial flows in real time when it's dealing with a particular shipment. So it makes it much harder to prove, which obviously makes it a great payment system to be exploited by organized crime networks. So worth remembering that Hawala and barter is becoming a thing. This isn't an African example, but there is evidence mounting around Latin America to show that large consignments of the raw ingredients for narcotics are coming in to Mexico in exchange for wildlife products that are coming out and flowing back to China. So there are often large wholesale systems of barter going on between the bad actors involved in these activities, which makes it very hard to follow the money, but it's more about following the value, as we know. A quick word about corruption. This is a really, really brief word about corruption. I mean, corruption is money laundering in its own right, because it's often proceeds of crime which are used to pay bribes, and bribery is an illegal act in I think most jurisdictions these days. And it's also governed by international instruments as well, like UNCAC and so on. So it's worth remembering there is an extraterritorial legal framework as well at play with crimes like money laundering and corruption that are connected to wildlife trade. This is something where there are many different forms of corruption, and I'm sure you are all more expert than I am in the practice, at least from a point of view of countering it rather than engaging in it. But there is functional bribery, and that we see it happening at one end of the supply chain around the transport systems, the facilitating the movement of goods between ports and across borders, and through, the use of shipping companies that obviously have to accept containers, customs agents that have to sign and stamp and seal those containers, and so on and so forth. So there is the supply chain corruption, which is more functional. And then there is grand corruption, which is more about building political patronage and really high levels of systemic grand corruption that can be really crippling to countries in the longer term and present much greater political insecurity, rule of law risks, and so on. As I mentioned before with the Hawala system, the value used in corruption transactions can also change hands in very complex, nuanced ways. So corruption doesn't always manifest as a brown paper bag. It also can be, a gift of property, of land, of a house, of services rendered, of some other system, whether it's cattle or some sort of gift system. So it's again, it makes it harder to identify, it makes it easier to conceal. So it is very much about following the value where you can. I know in the finance sector, it's more about following the money because that is the business you deal in. But from an investigation and law enforcement point of view, we like to encourage investigators to follow the value and look at lifestyle analysis and so on when they're looking at suspects. Just double clicked, it might skip forward. Hang on. Okay. So one example here is the Chroma network, which some of you may have seen articles about. I know the conservation and wildlife community can be quite a closed shop. It's not necessarily mainstream or as mainstream as we'd like it. But the Chroma network was a huge success of both local and international authorities working in coordination in Uganda. And across the world, not just Uganda, because the network wasn't just in Uganda, but the arrest of one of the most senior network members happened in Uganda in February 2017, when the local authorities intercepted and arrested three men, including one Moazu Koroma, who was a Liberian national who was resident in Kampala. And they found 1.3 tons of ivory in their house. So as you can imagine, it was a fairly big deal. And the more that local investigations uncovered, the more it became apparent that there were large amounts of money involved in this syndicate, and that they were probably linked to a huge number of ivory shipments. And there was a lot of different investigation techniques used, from forensic to phone imaging and so on and so forth. They started to really explore the financial aspect. And yet there were still huge gaps in the knowledge. So locally, the charges at the High Court for money laundering, which I think was the first time in Uganda that a money laundering charge had been applied to a wildlife case. So it was a euphoric moment for us people concerned with IWT and illicit finance. They discovered transaction evidence which suggested that he was regularly receiving, transactions of $80,000 from companies in Lao PDR. So there was obviously reason to charge him with money laundering. However, due to various jurisdictional challenges, the case floundered a little in the courts in Uganda, not for want of trying by the authorities. And the US took an interest in the case. As I mentioned before, there are international frameworks that govern money laundering, and the US has in recent years developed an appetite for actually going after people extraterritorially when it comes to wildlife trafficking. And Koroma and a further 3 accomplices, I think the last one was arrested in Kenya only about 10 days ago, that are all part of this network working across the African continent. They have been arrested and one by one they've been extradited to New York, and they're facing charges there for heroin trafficking, as well as trafficking of elephant and rhino horn products. And we're talking about huge amounts. So the $80,000 that authorities were seeing on some deposit slips and so on in Uganda, suddenly they're talking about amounts of product and illicit commodities worth around $7 million. So you can see how sometimes what we see due to a lack of capacity in terms of financial intelligence capabilities is just the tip of the iceberg. And it really illustrates to me how important it is that the private sector are engaged on these on investigation activities, on monitoring and detecting and reporting, just anomalies and suspicious activity, so that the relevant FIUs and so on in the country and the law enforcement agencies can do their work and investigate it. And I will say that Uganda has made an awful lot of progress, and they've really cut their teeth, I think, on the Koroma investigation, as well as several other high-profile arrests. And we've seen some really good financial intelligence coming out of the authorities there. The right-hand side is a analysis chart which has been suitably blurred out, but that's one of the bits of work that the team did on the Moazu Koroma case. So it's significant how far they have come in being able to track transactions. However, really, we want people in the banking sector and in the forex sector to be identifying these suspicious activities before it gets to a point of an arrest, because then there's much more chance of stopping the crime from happening and actually saving the elephants and the rhinos or the other affected species.
Time, Anne-Marie.
Time. Okay, I'll wrap this up really quickly if you just give me one more minute. So one thing I wanted to draw your attention to very quickly was the United for Wildlife Financial Task Force, which some of you may be familiar with. They're a partner of RUSI's, and they work as part of the Royal Foundation's work. That's the organisation, the NGO run by set up by the Royal Princes, Harry and William. And they have a declaration that their members commit to, which basically has some really sound objectives around raising awareness in the financial sector, and developing good practice in terms of policy and action and sharing intelligence and so on. And their risk bulletins and their typology reports are simply excellent. We sometimes feed into them. We help them set up the financial task force, which has got 44 global banks, but there's no reason why more regional banks, in fact, I think there are some regional banks on there like Nedbank and Bank of Namibia and so on. They're all on there, and they work very closely with the FSRBs like SAMLAG, and there's a chapter event. They've got regional chapters across Africa, We're going to be working on a West African regional chapter with them in due course. That hasn't appeared yet. That will hopefully be coming in the next year. But East and Southern Africa are up and running, and there's an East African event coming up. So for those of you in the region that are interested, please do get in touch. I can introduce you to Kate Bedwell, who's the Financial Task Force Manager, and there'll be a great avenue and a channel for further engagement if you're interested in pursuing that. I've got some offender typologies. I'm going to skip through these charts, but those of you who want the presentation, you'll be able to see a little bit more information about the way that payment methods and bank accounts are used by different types of offenders within that pyramid. And then the chart is really just a call to action to say, we love the fact that everybody signed up to listen to this webinar today. There's lots more to share. There's lots more to learn about. And there's some tips here on how you can sign up for mailing lists. You can use Google Alerts for certain search words to try and stay on top of news and developments and typologies in your own jurisdictions, which perhaps aren't necessarily covered in depth at the global reporting level, and engage with the United for Wildlife task forces. And then obviously, please do your bit. Share the presentation with your colleagues, maybe invite us to come and talk to them on a webinar event that you host internally. Whatever it is, however we can support you, we're really, our ears are open, and you know, you're very welcome to get in touch. And we really hope that this translates into a greater awareness of the risks, and that you might consider updating yourselves on the typologies to really optimize the reporting systems that you have. And lastly, but not least, please go to a national park in your home country or when you're on holiday nearby and enjoy the wildlife you have. It's something that when I did a lot of training when I was based in Uganda, and I used to train law enforcement agencies and organize training for this sort of work, I was always astounded at the number of senior police officers that were regularly involved in ivory consignment busts, and yet they'd never seen ivory on an elephant, which I think is really sad. And if you have an opportunity, take your families out for a weekend. Some of the lodges and the parks, they do discount rates for citizens. So go and enjoy the African wildlife firsthand if you can. And thank you very much for listening.